Welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I'm your host. It's great to be with you here today. Today on the episode, we've got Colin Redemer. Colin's a professor out at St. Mary's in California, and we're going to talk about things that I've really thought about as a Christian almost my entire life regarding sports, competition, anger, and I just really enjoyed the content today. So I hope you enjoy today's episode. Today's episode is brought to you by goldriverco.com. They're a great sponsor of the podcast. They make a great quality product. When this episode is coming out, maybe you forgot to buy someone a Christmas present. You got back and you were like, man, I really wish I could get them something. Go over to goldriverco.com, buy them an American product, a tea that's really going to bless them, whether it's something to get the day going or to wind down the day, looking for a nighttime routine. They've got everything you need over there. And it's still winter, so they've got that great hot cocoa mix. And you can go over there, use promo code Theology for 15% off your order. That's promo code Theology for 15% off your order at goldriverco.com. Let's get into the episode. Today I have on the show Dr. Colin Redemer. Not doctor, just
not
Colin.
Doctor yet. Just Colin.
Oh, all right, well, already messed it up.
No, it's fine. What's the difference between a doctor and a professor, Chase?
Well, a doctor is someone who's gotten a PhD.
Professor got the job.
There you go. And that's what matters.
That's right. So
You're
Professor Colin Redemer to you.
Professor, I got you. So you're out at St. Mary's in California, is that right?
That's right. St. Mary's College of California. I've been teaching there for, close to 15 years in their Philosophy and Great Books program.
Okay. And is St. Mary's Catholic?
They are Roman Catholic and sort of getting slightly less Roman Catholic by the year, depending on who you ask and what you think Roman Catholicism is. But if you aren't from the Bay Area, you know them because we're the ones that are good at basketball. So there's 70 St. Mary's colleges out there, but we're the ones that produce high quality basketball players. And we're actually surprisingly well represented on the Australian national team in the Olympics every year.
Man, that is some interesting information. I'm sure I have listeners who enjoy college basketball. I always try to get in it. Seems like a dude's thing to do, fill out the bracket. And every year I went to Texas A&M. We don't do that well. And so I'm very disinterested. I'm the guy that fills out the bracket and is like, I recognize that team. And I do recognize St. Mary's as being a basketball school. Same with Gonzaga. One of those schools that's relatively small. Now, you're not Catholic though, right? You're Protestant.
I would say I'm a Reformed Catholic. So yeah, I'm a Protestant.
Catholic. So what kind of church are you a member of?
A hot dog church, Chase. We go to hot dog church here in the Bay Area.
What does that even mean?
It's just, every Americans love hot dogs and we love this certain kind of church. And this church serves a lot of hot dogs and it's not fancy. I'm not, you've got ACNA listeners and OPC bros and all these people, I'm sure. And I just go to hot dog church, man. We love the Bible. We love Jesus. I'm not a pretentious guy when it comes to churches. I think being in the Bay Area, it certainly has informed my choices of where to go to church, as has, having at least a small grip of children who need to have actual kind of Christian community. And so your options are like these tiny little church plants, which might kind of appeal to your sensibilities. But that's it's not about me and my sensibilities, right? I need to find a community that's going to be able to represent the gospel in a way that matters and form the kids. And I want other families around my family. And the pastor at Hot Dog Church where I go is personally Reformed and very, very learned and has a great heart. And I trust him, on a lot of very important issues. So that's a short version of why we're there.
That's great. I love that vision. We're in Boulder, or I'm in Boulder, our church is in Boulder. And so it's funny when people come from different parts of the country where they're used to kind of big box church on every corner and then move to Boulder and it's like, there's four, and
there's four churches in Boulder.
4 good ones. Yeah. And we're a town of 120,000 people. And we're the only one of the 4 that is having a Christmas Day service this Sunday, which is, it is what it is. We're not going to talk about that on this podcast, but it's just, it's funny when people move from a different context and it's like, man, just go to a good church. We're going to be taught the Bible. You got a faithful pastor and you can join in church community with others. and they're all trying to walk faithfully with God, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, in other seasons of life, it wasn't. I wasn't at Hot Dog Church. I think in future seasons of life, I might not be. But for
Sure,
now, it's
that's
it's
great.
good. It's good for where we are.
Well, tell me a bit about your story. We haven't gotten the chance to kind of catch up. I've got your bio, from St. Mary's, but did you grow up in Hot Dog Church, or where did you grow up, and what did it look like for you to know Jesus?
Yeah, so I actually grew up in the main line, so very liberal United Church of Christ. If your listeners are familiar, you're probably familiar. Your listeners are probably familiar with the United Church of Christ because they hate them, or make memes about them with purple hair and stuff.
Sure.
And some of that's certainly true. You had a lot of the proto woke energy was present even when I was a kid in the United Church of Christ. But you also have. I mean, I think part of what informs my ability to be a faithful Christian at Hot Dog Church is because I was a part of a family growing up that was faithful Christians in a reasonably good congregation inside of a really crazy denomination. And you had a lot of good Christian families around, and they were studying the Bible, and they were preaching the gospel, and they were doing their best to be faithful in evangelizing their community. So that was definitely where I was formed. But I think like many young men, it was not like it took on the first dose. So we were a church going family from a young age, and my parents were very faithful about that, and knew it was important. But it wasn't something I was necessarily excited about inheriting and making part of my personal identity for most of my youth.
When did it really become something that you did make part of your personal identity? What was that like?
Yeah, I had an AMA a couple, like maybe a year ago or so, and somebody asked me that, and that actually gets us to the kind of point of this podcast that we're doing, because the roundabout way that I came into the faith and really owned it was through wrestling. So I was a wrestler. I was pretty competitive throughout high school. By the end of high school, I would say I was actually good at it, but by the beginning, I was definitely not. And I went to a wrestling camp called the J. Robinson Intensive Wrestling Camp. And anybody who's been a wrestler probably knows about this camp. It happens every summer for 28 days in Minnesota. J. Robinson was a famous wrestling coach and was an Olympic wrestler himself. He was also, if memory serves, I think he was an Army Ranger. And he would bring in like former Navy SEALs as well as some of the top wrestlers in the country to train these high schoolers. And, you would go to this camp, and everyone, there would be, I don't know how many hundreds of young men there, mostly young men. There were occasionally women. And he would push you to your absolute physical limit, to the point where, I think he said he had this speech he used to give at the beginning of the camp. I went 2 summers. And he said something like, a third of you, all of you will call home and cry to your mom before this camp is over. A third of you will be injured or go home and won't make it. You won't be standing here at the end. Another third of you will be standing here at the end, but will not graduate. And the final third of you statistically will graduate. And if you graduate, you're going to treasure this for the rest of your life. And they gave you this stupid t-shirt. It was black and yellow, and I plan to be buried in it. I actually have it in the other room. I'll go grab it before the end of this. I didn't get the shirt at the end of the first summer, and I went my junior year and just didn't get it, and it crushed me. I was just like, oh my gosh, you sort of have to walk into this room alone with all the coaches gathered there, and you just knew you'd failed. It's like, and you sort of thought about all the ways you'd failed all summer long, in spite of pushing yourself to your absolute physical limit. So the second summer I went back, I was like, I'm going to get that damn shirt. And I pushed myself all summer long. And eventually by the end, right, you walk in and they give you the shirt, and you walk out, and then you realize after the fact, like, yeah, I learned a lot about wrestling. I'm in probably the best physical shape of my life. But he would have, on top of 5 exercise sessions a day, there'd be like 1 motivational speech and 1 meditation session, which is not sort of religious. He would just say, look, you need to like be thinking about your life, your body, how you had to actually do this kind of interior soul searching. He's like, if you're kind of screwed up internally, you're not going to be able to wrestle. If you're sort of hung up about what's going on with your girlfriend and the thing you're hiding from your mom, you're not going to be able to wrestle. So he had you doing this introspective stuff. And then he would, in these lectures, he would ask you questions like, you had to have a list to graduate of 50 goals you wanted to accomplish by the time you were 30 years old, 40 years old. You had to list when you were going to accomplish each of these goals. I found this list when I turned 30, and it was shocking to me how many of these things I had accomplished,
Wow.
which a lot of people in my generation hadn't accomplished, like get married, have a house, have a career, have a graduate degree. And at the time when I was writing these goals, I was like, not the best student in high school. So it's kind of like, what would make you think, right, that you're going to be able to do this stuff? But you realize after the fact, once you've got the shirt, you're like, this wasn't actually about wrestling at all. Like, this was about becoming an adult. It was about becoming excellence. It was about pursuing excellence in all of its forms. And so there was a real sense that, like, before I came to the gospel and really owned it, I came to like this Spartan virtue of that the sport gave me, right? Of wanting to be just the most excellent version of myself that I could be. And in doing that, he would say, who are the examples in your life of people who've made it? You're not going to be a wrestler forever. What do you want to be when you're 50? And, you start thinking about that, and then you're looking around at, your buddy's divorced dad, and that guy's an alcoholic, and you're like, well, actually I've got two grandfathers and a dad who all seem to be like about as good as it gets. Like,
Yeah.
And that, I think, was that was when the pin dropped. And I basically came within about 6 months to say, I really want to be a Christian. Like, I don't know how to do that, but that's where I want to head. That's sort of more excellent even than the excellence of being a wrestler.
Man, that's so cool. I love that story. Is that part of the reason you wear headphones, is to cover up your cauliflower ears, or no?
I have a little spot of cauliflower ear on this. You can see the ears are not perfectly even.
Yeah.
I don't know if that shows up on the camera.
A little
bit.
But
this one's kind of bent in because there's a little bit of a pop there. But I never had it too bad. I was the other wrestlers would call me a pretty boy. So the real wrestlers, I mean, they have this. Go look it up. Your listeners can go look it up, and maybe I'll throw an image up there or something. But they have this really gnarly. It's like a little donut on their side of their head.
It's crazy. So. That's awesome, man. Yeah, the relationship of masculinity and sport. And I love how you brought in the kind of Spartan camp, because that's what I was thinking of when you're describing this. It's one I've really been curious about. So I grew up in a very high performance suburban culture where it was like you're always doing a sport. The two sports were baseball and football, and my dad always had me in summer camps, always going to kind of the select leagues, doing that kind of stuff from middle school. And in middle school is kind of when I really made my identity in Christ, or Christ really moved in my way in a powerful way. I grew up in the church, but part of the reason I want to talk about sport with you, especially as someone who thinks about virtue and ethics and these kind of things, is because it will help me. And so it'll help me process kind of like my own journey. So like what happened when I was a freshman in high school is I was on the football team. I had made varsity. I was a wide receiver. I was never really that big, but I was quick. And they were like, you need to go over the summer, you have to be in the weight room every day. And I was like, man, I don't want to do that. Like, I'd rather work for my dad. But there were kind of three values that I really felt conflicted about as a Christian. The excellence value I kind of got that, but that really kind of got in my system with like, I had these perfectionistic tendencies, still do, where it's like, if I don't measure up, I'm failure, those kind of things. And those were just things I could take to the Lord, and I've learned to do that. But the other two, one was competition, and the other was anger. And as a 15-year-old kid, especially a man, when you've got a lot of hormones coming online, and you don't really know what to do with those. And I would go to like Candy Cut camps out in Missouri, and it's very competitive summer camp for sports, Christian summer camp for sports. And everything was just about competition and beating other people and winning, which is actually one of my, personal like values, is like, I want to have an eye on like an aim for excellence. I want to win.
Absolutely.
But then I would read the New Testament, and what I would hear in church is this Jesus who was rather meek and mild. And I didn't sense competition being like a Christian virtue. And then what I discovered in my own heart is I'm on the bus to a football game listening to like Last of the Mohicans and Limp Bizkit, and I'm trying to get like psyched out of my mind and really angry because in order to perform well, I felt this kind of need. I've got to hate these other people. I've got to like want to beat them. And I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know what to do with those kind of conflicting values. Now, some of my friends that are solid Christians, they seem to have no conflict in their soul about it. Maybe it was because I was pietistic. I don't know what it was. They seem to be able to like roll with it. Like it is what it is. I've always been a fairly introspective person. And so maybe I was just way too introspective. But I remember coming home, telling my dad, I'm done. I can't do this anymore.
Hmm.
I quit the football team, quit the baseball stuff, switched to tennis, and switched to playing guitar. And I would like, lead Bible studies and that kind of thing. Typical stuff. My dad was worried I was going to become a pothead because that's kind of part of his story
Sure.
in high school.
Sounds
Um,
like some pothead behavior.
yeah, it's pothead behavior in a Christian school. So, um, I guess my question is like, how would you have counseled me back then
Mm-hmm.
regarding Christians entering a competitive environment like sport or even you could say business? Um, how does that like what virtues are we looking at in Christ or what ethics does Christianity offer someone like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think even before I get to Christianity, and there's a lot to unpack there about kind of the meek and mild Jesus, which is certainly true, but it's just not the only image of Jesus, right, that we get from Scripture, and the tradition of Christianity has lots of thinkers who have all kinds of other ways of trying to conceptualize what's going on, even in the incarnation, right? I mean, look at Athanasius's on the incarnation, and the birth of Jesus is like, it's almost like a Trojan horse image in a certain sense. It's like we're going to fool the demons into thinking that we're weak, but actually this is the form in which the power of God is being unleashed in the world, right? So, um, regardless, before we get there, um, it's a very practical question for me because I'm actually considering becoming the wrestling coach at my son's school, which I'm really
Okay.
excited about. I'm hoping that it works out. We've got some details to hammer out for scheduling and whatnot. And I've got a nephew who goes to the school who, if I do take it, would probably consider being on the team at least. He's probably the most competitive of all the nieces and nephews that I've got. This is just like the kid who's got the competition bug. He's got to win everything. I think it's beautiful. And I've had to sort of talk to him about this a number of times, just because the kids are playing backyard football or whatever, and what do you do with the kid who's like has to win? But of course, you don't always win.
Right.
And what I say is, just thinking philosophically, you want to try applying teleological thinking to the problem. And so,
Okay.
for people who aren't familiar with Aristotle or Greek, it's just, what's the end? What's the purpose, right? Play the tape forward. Okay, so you're really good at football and you beat all of your cousins, and then you join a football team and you beat everybody there, and then you make it to the NFL and maybe you become the greatest of all time, right? You leave Tom Brady in the dust. What's the point? It's like, what's the point? Is there any intrinsic point in the end? Who is Tom Brady competing with? I had a friend who was like on the tour bus with Madonna. He was like touring with Madonna. He's not like an important person in the sense that Madonna is, but he kind of got to listen in on her inner life, right? And one of the things that she's always thinking about is, how can I outdo myself? Like, she's afraid of failing. Competition, when you think of it teleologically, kind of inside of itself, the person you're really competing with is yourself. And there's a scene in the Iliad where Achilles has to finally go out and face Hector, and Hector's wearing his armor because he's gotten it off of his dead friend Patroclus. And it's the most beautiful scene because at the end of the Achilles, the most competitive, most kind of winnerist person ever is facing the greatest warrior from the opposing team, and he's wearing his own armor. And what is he looking at? He's looking at an image of himself.
Hmm.
So the highest point of competition is really a competition with the self. And so in that sense, for me, you once you see this principle, you don't really need the team anymore or the lifting buddy, because you sort of become your own, and you can recognize that what you're trying to do in your athletic enterprises or in any sort of competitive enterprise, whether it's business or whatever, is just outdo yourself, which then requires you to ask this subsequent question of like, well, what does winning really look like?
Right.
Right. Or as Jordan Peterson says it, I'm not a Jordan Peterson stan in all ways, but he's got a line where he says, one of the things you need to realize is, so you've won this game, right? But where does it fit in the game of games? And I think that's helpful, is like, in the end, and this is why most people who I think leave sports, obviously there's tragic cases where you get an injury, but right. A lot of people who leave a sport eventually, because I was going to go wrestle in college, and I left more or less because I looked around and I realized, where's this going? It was a really beautiful, fun way to spend my youth. I totally support the sport of wrestling in any way that I can. I had some really amazing experiences doing it. But it's not a game you can play forever. It has a kind of a place in a life. It has a place in society. And then you got to go kind of move on to other games.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And that's something I've really learned to value, is like, I'm not competing against, as a pastor, I'm not competing against other churches. I'm competing against who I was yesterday and how can I be a better man today? Because ultimately it's, being a pastor is not ultimately about just the vocation, being a pastor. It's about being a human, a Christian, and living into that. And by God's grace, that's how we grow. That's a helpful vision rather than this vision. You get a lot of church planners who play with a chip on their shoulder, and that can get you somewhere. That can provide a lot of fuel in the tank, so to speak, but not for very long. And
but I'm not even sure. I'm unconvinced that it's even the fuel that gets you that far. I think it's a poison far more often. It can look like it's working, but it's almost universally not working. The people who are really making an impact, the people who are really going far are, you look at the Tom Brady's of the world. Tom Brady doesn't get there by looking at Joe Montana and saying, or I don't know, whoever, Madonna doesn't get where she's getting by looking at Marilyn Monroe, right? They're thinking about themselves, and not in a like self-conscious way or a self-critical way, just a very realistic assessment of like,
sure.
What am I? It's what that wrestling coach was doing with me those summers, right? Jay Robinson. And those camps closed because of the pandemic, which is a bone I have to pick with the pandemic. I don't know if we're going there, but he basically went out of business and because of it. And it's like, dude, this changed so many lives. I can't tell you. It's like everyone I know who went there is a completely different person on the other end of it. It's like you get back from having to be beat the crap out of by like, Army Rangers and there's a real pro-socialization that happens, maybe particularly to young men. When you've got a coach, every young guy thinks of these hot stuff, and you've got some coach who's just yelling at you. It's like, you think you're hot stuff, like drop and give me 50 push-ups. So healthy, man. It's like so healthy. You come home from that and your mom's like, could you take out the garbage? You're like, yeah, that's easy. What else you got for me?
No problem.
Please. That's all I got to do today. I'm thrilled. Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, that's great.
And that was my mom's actually response after I came back the second time. She's like, you're a different person. You're
awesome.
Actually doing your chores.
Isn't that nice? Maybe that's what I'll do for my sons, and I'll just send you to a camp where it's really hard and say bye.
Yeah. Just drop them off there.
Yeah, until they come back and want to take out the trash. Yeah, it was interesting. Because I grew up in Kanakuk where they would do that. Like the push-ups were consequences for, all sorts of things. And then I worked at another summer camp, and I started I was a counselor for kids. Some were juvie or whatever. And I would try to do that stuff at that summer camp, and I got in big trouble because they were like, no, we don't have that. We don't do that here. We just encourage people. And I'm like, what? Like, that's what is formative. Like, guys need that. Like, they need that in their life.
There's a clip that went viral. There's a lot of people who dislike football now. And there's a clip that went viral of some coach just smacking some player on the head after he made some boneheaded move, or I don't know, who knows what he did. I don't know. And all these people were just hating on, oh my gosh, can you believe it? This is toxic masculinity. This is, they were saying all these things. And, looking at it as a guy who was that 15-year-old who definitely got smacked around by my coach, it's like, certainly it can get out of hand, but certainly there are times where it was really helpful.
Yes. Yeah.
It's just really helpful. It's like, And you can, and then you can think about other times where you're like, I wish somebody had been there,
Right.
to just smack me. Be
Yeah.
like, come on, man.
Let's go.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Think about what you're doing, right? It's like,
yeah, totally.
Oh yeah, I'm not thinking. I'm just pissed off. I'm just making reactive, kind of insane moves.
Yeah. What do you do with the sense that, for a lot of guys who compete, again, transferable kind of like environment that people in business will know about, or anybody that wants to get ahead in their vocation or career, there is, particularly with men, this anger that can come up either when you don't perform your best, or you lose to somebody else, or you can use that anger to try to motivate you to, like, to put it in biblical terms, if we're not supposed to have hatred in our heart, we're supposed to love our enemies. That became a bit of a sticking point for me, where I'm like, well, am I loving this person with this anger in my heart, where I just want to destroy them?
Mm-hmm.
How did you manage that tension? What did that look like? Does it go back to kind of the theological stuff, or what does it look like to deal with anger as a man in that kind of environment?
Yeah, I think anger is definitely keyed as a bad thing nowadays. Plato would have used the term thumos, which is sometimes translated as anger, and I like to translate it as spiritedness.
Okay.
And so the thumotic nature is probably stronger in men. It certainly expresses itself in a more direct way in men. And I think it's distinct from wrath. So there is a way in which it can bleed into wrath. And I think if you kind of feed on it the wrong way, you can just grow to really hate somebody.
Right.
And, but Scripture seems to operate on the principle that you're just going to have enemies, and you're going to have a certain amount of this anger, this spiritedness. I mean, I think, Paul is a pretty spirited guy. I mean, Jesus gets fired up. And so you have images of people. I mean, Martin Luther, we could go on, and you could think about examples in your own life of pastors who have a kind of a righteous anger. And then, of course, not all of it's righteous. Not all of it is the kind of anger that you just have to like go full throttle with. It's just, it's like you said, right? If you're going to, nowadays, most of my exercise is weightlifting. If you're going to lift a lot of weight, you got to get pumped up a little bit first, jump up and down, take some deep breaths like you're hyperventilating, listen to some music slightly too loud for your eardrums to hear. And don't do that all the time, right? But if you're trying to push yourself, you got to kind of get yourself in this pumped up space. And so I think there's a level of recognizing that it is a distinct power within the human soul. This would be the kind of philosophical approach. You would say, look, I have a rational power, I have a desiring element, and I have this competitive element. And you could read about this in C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, right? The head, the belly, and the chest. And this is one of those powers, and I have to learn how to use it, and use it in moderation, and use it in a right ordering with the other things. I think from the Christian lens, what we can add to that is that the Holy Spirit gives you self-control. And so maybe the key is not like, are you angry at someone? That's not concerning. What's concerning is the anger in control of you? Is it making your decisions for you? Is it determining how you're responding to people? This is because the Holy Spirit gives you the power of self-control. It really comes from, weirdly, right? Self-control comes from outside of you. That's a kind of a funny paradox. But even before that, right, these natural senses of moderation and of the place of it, and how does wisdom relate to competitiveness? I mean, that's in there in Plato and Aristotle. It's in there in Confucius. There's plenty of resources out there. And you can even just think through the character, just think about the kind of character who, from a natural perspective, not even thinking about Christianity, is kind of foolish, rushes in, picks fights with everyone, isn't thinking about whether or not they can win. That's a kind of a losing strategy in general, right? Whereas the wisdom of keeping your friends close and your enemies closer, of picking your battles, of strategic withdrawal, strategic retreat, identifying when you're in a winning position and then striking. All of those things I think are it's just prudence. And Scripture says we're supposed to be as shrewd as snakes, but as guileless as doves. And that is actually, I used to go to one of my first gigs was like a youth intern, and you had to have like a life verse, and I thought it was a little hokey, so I was making fun of them, and I said my life verse is to be as shrewd as snakes, which is of course half of a verse.
Sure.
But I do think that it's an underexplored way of thinking about the Christian life, and it relates to this issue of anger, right? It's like, okay, good, so you're competitive, you want to win, like, how do you win? What is winning? Let's win.
Yes, that's great. That's really helpful. And I think, what makes me really sad, and I don't know if you see this, but I see this, is a lot of men, it's particularly Christian men, they, and maybe it's just my own testimony, but they fail to have either church environments or pastors or leaders, people at wrestling camps, whatever it may be, that can help them temper and grow in character and pursue excellence. And so then I feel like for many people, they're left with kind of like, well, I guess those things aren't welcome. Therefore, I'll become this kind of like what we call it at our church is a wet blanket dude, where there's not a lot of desire, not a lot of passion, tends to be fairly feminized in their mannerisms and interactions with other people. And they become they're so afraid of those passions, that drive, that competition, that anger, that either they don't share with anybody, they don't tell anybody about it, or they just view it as outright wicked. And therefore they try to manufacture a view of growth and character development, which is devoid of any of those kind of aspirations or desire to win. And so you get a lot of men who just become very, just like wet blankets. Like, because I would show up to small group oftentimes as the pastor, and I'm a very spirited person, and I have a lot of thoughts and ideas, can run a little hot sometimes, but I would want to talk about stuff. Let's chop it up. Let's talk about things. Let's dive into topics. What movie are you seeing? Oh, I hate that movie, and there's just like, they would almost be horrified that I would be expressing myself and just trying to connect with other people relationally in that way. Because they're like, you shouldn't be, that's inappropriate. And I'm like, okay, well, it's just human. Like, we're just trying to be dudes, connecting with other guys,
Yeah, I mean, I think the spirited power of the soul has to be opened up before it can be tamed. And so I think a lot of people are really freaked out by it because they haven't gone through that experience of like really letting themselves just like get angry and pissed off and really try to win something. And I think it's dangerous to just kind of crack it open on your own, which is why sports facilitate this second piece, which is you have to sort of open it up if you're going to be able to master it. And you have to open it up in the presence of somebody who knows how to master it so that they can smack you when you're getting it wrong, right?
Sure, yeah.
And it's actually analogous to the way Plato, what I'm saying now is analogous to the way Plato talks about drinking. He thinks that young people should engage in drinking so that, but it's analogous in the sense of their language and their logic. It will get them to say things that they are kind of too self-conscious to say, but they should only do this in the presence of an older person who can prune them.
Sure.
And who can sort of get into their soul and say like, that was funny, that was over the line, right? And it's the same thing with anger. If you just leave kids in a playground unattended, anger is going to pop up. Somebody's going to let it out. Somebody's going to get hurt. It could get really bad. And somebody might develop a habit of hurting people really badly. And that's even worse, right? And it's bad for them. What happens if you put them in a wrestling room or on a football team or in any of these places is, you sort of have it's like going to the gym and saying, okay, now is the time we're going to get pumped up and we're going to kind of like use that. We're going to push in that way. Or having later, once it's mastered, you can use it in a management situation. You can tell a team of guys like, okay, now we're going to go raise some money, right? Yep. We're going to go sell the thing. We're going to code the the website, and you force people into this competitive mindset of like, it's time to go get on the field, put the the uniform on and win. And I think it's an extremely, extremely powerful tool that everyone should be able to put in their toolkit. To do it, you got to sort of be there. It's the kind of thing that has to happen inside of the dojo, right? It can't happen on your own in your backyard. You're gonna like break your hand.
Yeah, I think about an analogy. We had a guy that we eventually brought on staff, and we were playing just a competitive kickball kind of church. It was supposed to be just social, but if I'm there, it's going to be competitive. And we were playing, and this guy who's normally he's a very kind man, and I really enjoy his company. And I watched him out there, and what I call it, I don't know what other guys would call it, but I call it the kill switch. And you can see when somebody all of a sudden takes it and they go, I want to win. And their eyes kind of light up. And I'm like, I want that. Like, I want to work with somebody like that. I can't work with people, or it becomes really difficult to work with people who don't have that kill switch or that ability. When we're assessing church planners, it's the same thing. Like, I almost wish there's all these church planning boot camps or training things, whatever it is. And I'm like, I want a physical component, not because, not for any other value, but for character revealing. Like, let's put them in an environment where they're pushed to their breaking point, and let's see what's there. Like, let's see what comes out in that, because we can better assess, rather than like sitting across from a table and saying like, how's your soul, and asking these theological questions, which matter. How much more fun and how much more insightful might it be if we put them in a high stress situation, whatever that may be, and then saw what comes out of that, and then got them to work with other people, like on a team. I just think that'd be really fun.
Well, and it's interesting that you sort of lumped in theological questions with the kind of therapeutic approach of like, how's your soul? Because I think theology done properly functions much more similarly to the dojo or the wrestling mat or the football team. It's distinct, right? Because it's not about your body performing some function. And because, you have to, winning is not predetermined by us, right? That's the thing about sports. It's like, we actually decide who wins. And that's, we can change the rules, and rules to sports change over time, right? And so what is winning? It's literally just something we make up. It's a game we make up. Theology is actually like the game where you're playing for all the stakes, and you don't make it up, right? There's some rules that are made up that are just there. Like, in reality, you're like, oh, the law of non-contradiction. Okay. Like, I guess I can't do that, you can't just kind of say the Bible doesn't matter. These are the basic rules. Yeah. But once you're engaged in that process, it's profoundly different. And Bible studies can be profoundly different from the kind of soft pedaled group therapy sessions, which sometimes they are. And group therapy, I think, is great. Sometimes people need it. I think if it helps a demographic sort of come to Jesus, I go to hot dog church. I'm all for it. But there's a different demographic. There's a different kind of guy. There's a different structure, which I think people are longing for, where, you're actually in the dojo and you're watching people spar. And then eventually you're like, okay, I think I'm going to give it a shot. And you like step in the ring and you get thrown.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll talk about my teaching in this way, because I'll teach a lot of seminar classes. That seminar is, a good seminar is like a karate dojo, because you go in there and you're watching people make certain moves, and there are certain rules, and you're sort of trying to figure out and understand the meaning of the text. And, you can get thrown. You can get thrown by the text. You can get called for being out of bounds, and you can get thrown by somebody else in the room if you sort of are wrong about a text.
Right.
And I think people know this implicitly. So when you say it, they tend to appreciate it, because the reason people are afraid of speaking in a seminar is because they don't want to be wrong. It's like, that's telling, that tells you that they know.
Yeah.
That there's something. This is not just like a chat,
Right.
We're not just, this is not, just shooting the breeze. And that, I think following that thread can be very helpful.
I think so too. And I think it plays into small group ministries in churches when it depends on the rules that that group or that church has set. And if they don't set rules, rules will be set. People inherently perceive and are shaped by cultural standards. And so for a lot of small groups, they're not governed by the word of God and by rules. They're governed by empathy or, kind of some other value of what does it mean to win? Well, to win means, I cried tonight at small group, or, I shared, some of my deepest, darkest secrets. I was radically transparent, and then you throw a guy in that small group who has the dojo mindset. We're gonna argue. We're gonna fight for truth,
and then they're gonna make someone cry.
They're gonna make somebody cry,
not for the reasons that they want to.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes a really complicated pastoral issue as you try to set kind of like boundaries and rules for people, and then even if you try to shift a group to be less oriented towards one than the other, it becomes really interesting. One thing I wanted to ask you about, particularly as it pertains to sport, is I have a philosophy professor at Denver Seminary, and he's like written off football together. And it's not for the reason I would write off football, but his reason is because it's so violent. And it really came online for me in the last couple of years. I was watching ESPN, and they had women MMA fighters, and I was really mortified. Like it was disgusting to me. I was repulsed, and I turned it off. And I was like, what did I sense just then? Like, what am I watching? What does that reflect about our society, that we have a bunch of men watching women try to beat each other up, bleeding, for entertainment and sport? And so help me understand from your perspective, when does sport cross a line to where, you have the early Christians, and you've got the Roman games, and they would say, like, you can't go there. You can't participate in that kind of entertainment. So how do you reason about the difference between when a sport becomes violent beyond redemption and when a sport like wrestling seems to be something that's actually very useful for society?
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that I think wrestling or football's not really that violent, and it's like, to think of it as violence is to not understand the category of violence.
Okay.
And I've got a long running argument with a buddy of mine about whether or not the UFC or football is, MMA or football is more violent. I'm not really sure. In either case, though, neither of these are really violence. Okay. They're both highly controlled. It's like a play that we're putting on about violence, about competition, about war that isn't quite war. And so that if you're thinking of it from that kind of social, societal level, I think of it more like I think of, watching Netflix or something. You're going there to experience the drama of life and human competition and struggle. And that's why I think some of those common features, like saluting the flag beforehand, are really valuable, because they establish the common ground that exists outside of the four lines that make up the football field, right? There's a world that exists out there, and then when we get on the field, we're going to engage in the play of football, and real violence is like when people kill each other, and right. That really happens. And blood sport is a different thing. It's not really sport. So I think that would be the clearest and simplest way for me to draw the line. I think there's some legitimate questions about, how much the NFL knew about what was, was this harming the players and in what way? And, they have a union they're negotiating with. It's another issue I care a lot about. And they're lying to the people they're negotiating with. That's a big deal. Yep. So, but, you can find material compensation for this stuff. It's not like it kills you, tomorrow. Sure. There's certainly a quantity of football you can engage in and lead a relatively normal human life. We can figure that out.
Yeah. I was over in Spain, and I went to a bullfight, because over there they have those. Mm-hmm. And an American stood up who wasn't friends with me, and started yelling, decrying the bullfight. And that's its own form of violence. That the goal in
But
that.
similar category error, right? Because they're
Yeah.
thinking that's a human. They
Yeah.
basically think that we're killing a human. It's like, no, dude, that's a steak.
That is a steak. That's going to be a burger, man.
Yeah.
All right. To go back to kind of what you talked about and connect it to kind of a ministry or educational institution you're connected with, Davenant. We talked about kind of like competition, getting in the dojo. You're the vice president of the Davenant Institute, which is like I'm going to say it to my listeners and then you correct me. It's like an alternative education kind of group that helps people get either certifications or degrees, and helps guys, people come together to pursue the truth and excellence together. And within that, you're going to have different viewpoints, all that kind of stuff. So how do you bring kind of this ethos, these virtues that we're talking about here into an environment like that, where you've got people that disagree on all sorts of matters? What does it look like at the Davenant Institute for that to play out?
Yeah, great question. The Davenant Institute advances and renews Christian wisdom for the contemporary church. We're just finishing our year-end fundraising drive. If folks are listening, we didn't get enough money. Please give us more. And if you're a donor, thank you. So just put that out there too, because some of these are probably donors. I would say, there's a wide range of perspectives at Davenant, and that's something that that we're pretty proud of, because friendship is properly an interrogation into reality with another person. And I would say we are, in no small part, our founding and our ethos in general is precisely the kind of thing we've been talking about, right? There's a sense in which, sure, lots of good came from the small group movement that started in the 1970s, and also there's a lot that was kind of left on the table, or off the table, for people who wanted to have this deeper investigation into the nature of reality, with these kind of competitive ground rules, and going someplace where you could get thrown. And I think that's why you saw certain alternative things popping up. We could talk about who's the guy who they had the whole podcast to try to cancel him, Mark Driscoll. So they're like, the Mark Driscoll thing.
Just a small name.
Yeah, I never really paid attention to it until that came out. So again, I'm from the main line. That's not.
That's like all our world. I'm actually 29,
yeah.
so like that was
right.
like
Okay, so
this is our guy.
He's your guy. But yeah, I mean, when Davenant came about, I mean, you're not going to find a lot of people who are like pumping iron and stuff. I mean, there's some people in Davenant that are more athletic and whatnot, or have that background, but we still have the dojo mindset. We just have it around ideas. We have it around the truth. We have it around the history of the church. We have it around philosophy. Guys who show up at the Davenant Institute regularly tell me that they were the smartest person in their church, in their social circle. They were the smartest Christian that they knew in real life. And then they show up at the Davenant Institute and they're surrounded by a bunch of people who are very intimidating.
Yes.
And that's, the nice thing is that's true for everyone who shows up there.
Sure.
You might know a lot. I know a lot about Aristotle. There's maybe one or two guys who know Aristotle as well as I do, maybe better. But there's a lot of people who know a lot of other things that I just don't know anything about. And it creates a very different experience, because you then ask a question in common, or to use the sports metaphor, right? The ball gets rolled onto the field. And you have to decide, like, am I going to go for this ball
right
in front of these guys who know all the stuff I just don't know?
Right.
And you take some bruises, and it's a really delightful experience. But of course, if you don't know how the life of the mind works, you step in there and it can look like almost nothing is happening, right?
Sure.
Which is sort of a funny paradigm. Once you've had a little bit of education and you know how real academic conversations are supposed to function, you realize it's like an electric, live wire is sort of sitting in the middle of the room at all times. Josh Abatoy, who's a buddy of mine from American Reformer, came down to the Davenant House this summer, and he sort of watched an argument go on, and it was like the most muted, polite tones, just, but what about this? I don't think you're considering. And he was like, this is like it's like the highest level argument you've ever seen. Two people who just disagree in the most profound ways. They're just fighting tooth and nail, trying to take each other down. But it looks like from the outside, it looks like a Vulcan mind meld.
Right.
So that's some of the ways in which I think this bleeds into that. And what happens is it ends up producing extremely beautiful high level content. And that's not the point of it, right? We didn't get together as the Davenant Institute to like write a book and go viral.
Sure.
We got together as the Davenant Institute because we wanted to ask certain questions, and there was no space for us to do that. And we were like, well, we should just build the space.
That's
right?
great.
We should build the institution.
That's great. I love that. I mean, that's part of the reason I started the podcast was because I showed up at a Acts 29 pastors cohort a couple of years ago, and all these guys are like 40s, 50s, older than me. And they look at me and they go, Chase, you're the smartest guy in this room. And I was like, oh no.
It's pretty terrifying.
Is that true? Because if that's true, I need to leave. Like, I love you guys. Like, no offense.
Yeah.
But if you're telling me that. And so I started the podcast because I'm like, well, I can just reach out to people. If I don't have my own like Davenant type thing here, I can at least get guys like you on the podcast and like, let's learn, let's chop it up and let's figure out how I can do better.
Well, I think you should come to Davenant, Chase.
Yeah, well, if you want to scholarship me, maybe we can have more donors donate.
Yeah, some of you sign him up. All right, everybody, get him out here to South Carolina. I'm not actually in South Carolina, but that's where the house is.
That's great. I mean, that's what I'm connected with. Andrew Sandlin at the Center for Cultural Leadership. I'm a senior fellow there, and they know how to do that. They're fighting about ideas, and I was just out there a few weeks ago, and so I love that kind of environment.
We're certainly at an institution. I would like to think of us as a leading institution, but we're inside of an ecosystem for sure, of plenty of places that I think are responding to very similar dynamics in the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for coming on the show and kind of sharing these thoughts. I know for me, it's been super helpful just to think about my own story, how God's worked, and then how I can be a better man. If people wanted to follow you, kind of keep in touch with what you're writing about, speaking, all that kind of stuff, obviously we want to send them to the Davenant website. Is that just davenant.com? What's the website for Davenant?
I think it's davenantinstitute.org. But, just find me on Twitter at Redem the Times. And there's, I grift off of that. So I'll post a bunch of stuff and you'll find your way in. I'm the co-host of the Ad Fontes podcast. So we've got a podcast, which I do, which is connected to the Ad Fontes magazine, the magazine of the Davenant Institute. I'm the provost of Davenant Hall, which is our online university. Maybe sometime we'll come and talk about the death of higher education and its coming rebirth, which we're participating in. And then we run conferences and have publications and do all kinds of things. But really great to be on your show, Chase. We just met in Denver briefly, and I said we got to connect more. So Good to finally get to talk to you.
Absolutely, man. Well, thanks for coming on the show. If you're a listener and you enjoyed this episode, I would just encourage you to subscribe, leave it a great rating, share it with somebody. As I kind of said in the episode, I want this podcast to be a source of good sparring in the Christian community. And so maybe you can share with a friend who you want to spar with, grab a beer, and y'all can think deeply. As I mentioned at the top of the show, this episode is brought to you by Gold River Co. Go over to goldriverco.com, pick up some American tea, relive the Boston Tea Party, have a great time, get us a gift for a loved one or a friend. Or
throw it in the Boston Harbor.
There you go. Throw it in the
Just
Boston Harbor.
Travel
over there and toss it. All right. Well, we will see you next time. Leave a great rating and look forward to seeing you all again.
Take care.